Hello everyone, this is Nökvi from Birds of Play, and in this video we are once again going to be taking a look at some of the differences between the Japanese and the English promotional material for the much anticipated Final Fantasy XVI. Last time we looked at the differences between the Japanese and the English versions of the Final Fantasy XVI trailer, but this time around we are going to be looking at the official Final Fantasy XVI website instead. There is a lot of information to unpack on the website, relating to the game world and the characters, that you might already be starting to get somewhat familiar with if you've been keeping up with the latest news on the game. Looking at the Japanese version of the website does, however, afford us some tidbits of additional information, as well as enable us to get a feel for some of the more subtle nuances between how the game is being presented in Japanese and English respectively. If you like the video and want to see more videos about Final Fantasy, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join us for the hopefully not too long wait for the eventual release of Final Fantasy XVI. But then again, waiting is a lot more enjoyable when you have good company. So, looking at the website in both Japanese and English, we can see that they have an identical structure to them, both featuring this absolutely fantastic piece of concept art for the game at the very top of the page, followed by the trailer for the game, information on the game world and the characters, and then lastly, a message from the developers. Looking at the tagline for the game, we can already see some differences between the Japanese and the English versions. The English tagline being, "The legacy of the crystals has shaped our history for long enough," while the Japanese line goes, "Koru wa kristaru no kago o tajikiru tame no monogatari," which could be translated as, "This is the story of cutting ties with the divine protection of the crystals." The lines are similar enough on the surface, and both of them can be interpreted as either referencing the changing status of crystals within the world of Final Fantasy XVI, or as a meta-commentary on the Final Fantasy series as a whole, possibly insinuating that future installments might take the franchise even further away from its roots. But that's all speculative at this point. A more concrete point of comparison, however, is the way the Japanese version of the tagline talks about the game as a story as opposed to being written in character from the perspective of someone that might be a part of the game world. Of course, an in-game character could refer to the events of the game world as a story, just like Tidus and Auron do in Final Fantasy X. However, as we will see a bit later on, this isn't the only reference to Final Fantasy XVI as a story, and might go to show how not only the game, but also the concept of what a game is in itself, is being portrayed differently in the context of Final Fantasy XVI's Japanese media incarnation, the story part of the play experience being emphasized as opposed to immersion within the game world itself. Moving on to the next feature of the website, we can see the trailer. But since we've already looked at the trailer in another video, we are not going to be doing that here. But you can of course always check out the video we did on the Japanese script differences in the trailer if you haven't already. But I'll just mention that both versions of the trailer are titled Awakening, written exactly the same way using English, because in some cases English is considered very cool in Japan, the name Final Fantasy itself being a testimony to that fact. Scrolling a bit further down, we are treated to another example of the supposed coolness of English in Japan, since even the Japanese version just says world and offers more details, just like the English version. However, if you look at the site in other languages, such as Spanish or French, you can see that these things are translated into their respective languages, meaning that keeping the English in for the Japanese version is most likely a deliberate choice, because English is so cool and sexy-like. But now, getting to some of the actual meat on the bone, the more details page is loaded with new information about the lore of the game world and its geographical properties. Starting with the world and the information about dominance, I'm going to perform a little bit of magic by snapping my fingers and thereby generating a more literal translation of the Japanese text. The reason I do this is not to say that there is anything wrong with the English translation. It's actually quite good, and oftentimes even more informative than the Japanese. It's just so you can compare it for yourself if you're interested, but I will of course be talking about the differences that I think are important. So just pause the video while I do my magic if you want to read it for yourselves, but otherwise just trust me. And there we are. Now looking at the actual setting for the game, we can see that it's called Valisthea, or Varisthea in Japanese, and that is a place that receives the divine protection of the crystals. The crystals blessing the land with ether, or eteru, that enables the populace to live in relative safety from outside forces. Ether being one of the many supposed communalities between Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy XIV, the game that Naoki Yoshida, the producer of XVI, and Hiroshi Takai, the director, are most well known for. But the major difference in the Japanese version compared to the English is actually to be found in the last line. The English line, reading as, "Yet now the peace falters as the spread of the blight threatens to destroy their dominions." while the Japanese line says, "So, 世界が黒の一体に蝕まれるまでは," meaning, that is, until the world gets devoured by the Black Land, or Black Region, or something to that effect. Here we have some different terminology, on the one hand talking about the Blight in English, and then Black Land or Region in the Japanese version. The reason this is important will become apparent a bit later, since it will enable us to make some important connections with other information. So for now, just remember this talk of Black Land or Black Regions. Next up we have the dominants, those that house the summons. Both languages describe dominants as people that house powerful summons within their own bodies and are able to call upon their power. This ability is either admired or feared, depending on the culture of the place the dominant is born into, sometimes having them celebrated as royalty, and other times seeing them used as weapons of war. The most notable translation difference at this point is the English term eikons, while the Japanese version talks about shokanju, which is a more general term for summons in the Final Fantasy series. Meanwhile, the term eikon may technically have the same meaning, but it also connects the game even more to Final Fantasy XIV, since the term is used in the English version of that game as well. Scrolling down again, we get to see this very interesting world map, whereas the English version of the website just says the realms of Valisthea. The Japanese version adds some subtext that reads Mother Crystal o itaku Valisthea no kuni-kuni, meaning the countries of Valisthea embraced by the mother crystals. But enough about that, let's look at this very detailed map for a second to make use of some of the things we've learned so far. So, notice anything? Well, there are a lot of things to notice, but what I'm thinking of at the moment are these darker parts of the map that I would like to theorize are the Kuro no Ittai, or Black Lands, or the Black Region, namely the Blight in English. And there will be some more information to support this claim as we read about the different countries. Also, when we get to the characters, we will be able to make one more important connection with this word kuro, or black, so stay tuned for that. Moving on to the countries themselves, we can see that there are 6 in total. I'm going to work my magic again and give you the chance to check out a more literal translation of the text into English. Here I go. And the remaining 3. And there we have it. So let's check this out and see whether we will find anything of interest. Starting with the Rosaria Kokoku, or the Duchy of Rosaria, we can tell right away from the banner that this is a country where the phoenix is revered. The country is located in the western part of Valisthea, and its mother crystal, Torekubresu, or Drake's Breath, is situated on a volcanic island off the coast. Here again we have the Kuro no Ittai, or Black Lands mentioned, simply being replaced with a Blight in English. One interesting thing to note is that the Japanese spelling for Rosaria Kokoku is the same as for the Rosaria Teikoku from Final Fantasy XII. I'm not holding my breath, or my Drake's Breath, but will we finally be getting a proper storyline for Al Cid Margrace? I doubt it. Very much. Very, very much. But it's still a fun connection to make. Moving on to the Holy Empire of Sambureku, we can see that we finally have an official English name. Sambureku is a country that was mentioned in the Japanese trailer, but not the English one, so it's great to see its existence being confirmed here. The Japanese version of the text mentioned Sambureku as the largest religious state in the world, while the English talks about the largest theocratic force in Valisthea. Both versions deliberately omit the name of the summon, or eikon, that is associated with the country, but judging by the banner, the obvious guess would be Shiva. Both because of the ladylike appearance of the top figure on the banner, reminiscent of other incarnations of Shiva from the Final Fantasy series, but also because of the 2 dragons below, Shiva being heavily associated with dragons in Final Fantasy XIV Heavensward, not to mention that the notion of a religious state that has some connection to dragons is practically screaming Isgard. Next up we have the kingdom of Worudo, which is located to the east, ruling the entirety of Hai no Tairiku, or the continent of Ash. Simply referred to as Ash in the English version. Just like with Sambureku, the name of the eikon is omitted, but judging by the banner, I think it's pretty safe to say that it's Odin, or Odin as we like to say in Icelandic, his horse Sleipnir, or Sleipnir, being depicted on the banner with 6 legs. Even though the Sleipnir from mythology has 8 legs, this one only has 6, but that's perfectly in line with other depictions of Sleipnir in Final Fantasy games. Lastly, I just want to mention that the Worudo Okoku, or the Kingdom of Valoed, as it's been transcribed into English, is seemingly constantly fending off orcs and beastmen from the borders. Looking at the map, we can see that there are a lot of dark spots on the continent of Ash, which might be home to these creatures, leading me to further speculate that the Kuro no Itai, or the Blight, is actually represented by these dark spots on the map. Fourth on the list is the Dalmekia Kyowakoku, or the Dalmatian Republic, consisting of 5 different states. Unlike the last 2 countries, we are explicitly told that this country's Eikon is Titan. You know, the big guy from the trailer? And that Titan's dominant is an independent member of the country's parliament. Simple enough, although I do prefer the Japanese wording in this case, using the word Tokuji, meaning independent, as opposed to the English version talking about the dominant being a special advisor. The dominant being an independent member of the parliament just evokes these ideas within the very core of my soul that he's, I'm assuming it's a he, will break away from the rest and play some sort of pivotal role in some important decision. Him being a special advisor just doesn't sound as cool, even though it might result in the same events I've hereby prophesied. The 5th country we get to hear about is Tetsuokoku, or the Kingdom of Iron. The Kingdom of Iron being a fairly straightforward translation of the Japanese name, just like all the countries priorly mentioned. A big difference, however, is that in the Iron Kingdom, dominants are considered unholy abominations and are executed if one happens to be born within the kingdom. In the Japanese version of the text, the islands of the Iron Kingdom are said to be located on the Kaze no Tairiku, or the continent of wind. This information is missing from the English version. What it could mean, however, is anyone's guess. Maybe the Eikon Garuda can be found on the islands, which wouldn't be surprising considering that Garuda is Final Fantasy XIV's quintessential wind summon. I would nevertheless also want to point out that the banner of the Iron Kingdom is also reminiscent of other things from Final Fantasy XIV, such as the Marauder Axis, but perhaps even more importantly, there's something there in the background that looks a whole lot like an infernal nail from the battle with Ifrit in that game. This might allude to the fact that Ifrit's dominant is actually from the continent of wind, and due to the fact that dominants are considered outcasts over there, we might be dealing with some sort of renegade that attacks the Phoenix for their own nefarious purposes. There's another prophecy for you. But now we come to the last country on the list, the Kuristaru Jichiro, or the Crystalline Dominion. Here we see some differences in the actual name of the place, since Jichiro implies a self-governing dominion, while a dominion is, well, just a dominion. Since the Crystalline Dominion is an independent territory, ruled by representatives from the surrounding nations, Jichiro is perhaps a bit more descriptive, but I think players playing the game in English will manage somehow to put 2 and 2 together. And that's all we know about the world for now, which means we finally get to move on to the characters. The website introduces us to 3 characters, Clive, Joshua, and Jill, so once again it's time for some magic. Amazing! So, starting with Clive Rushfield, the first thing his Japanese introduction can clarify is how his name is pronounced. So in Japanese, it's spelled Clive. I heard some people, including the Night Sky Prince, pronounce it as Cleave or something, which I actually think isn't so bad, but the Japanese version of the website seems to confirm that it is in fact Clive. Not trying to throw any shade on the Night Sky Prince, mind you, I love me some Night Sky Prince. Are you watching? I hope he's watching. That would be great. But anyway, on with the analysis. So in the Japanese version, we also get told that Clive is 15 years old when the game starts. In the English version, it's mentioned that he won a tournament at the age of 15, but the Japanese seems to confirm that he will also be 15 at the start of the game, meaning that we might get a chance to take part in that specific tournament. The last thing I want to mention about Clive is some very sexy information that has to do with the Kuro, or black, like I mentioned earlier. We already know that the Blight is called Kuro no Itai, and that there are dark spots on the map. But here we have something else that is black, namely Kuroki Ifurito, or the Black Ifrit. In the English version he is called a Dark Eikon, but that title is more reminiscent of Dark Aeons from Final Fantasy X than anything we have talked about so far from Final Fantasy XVI, although I guess you could make a loose connection between the Dark Eikons and the dark parts of the map. On its own, that would be a bit of a stretch, however, but coupled with the fact that the Blight is called Kuro no Itai and the Dark Ifrit is called Kuroki no Ifurito, I think that it's safe to assume that there is a meaningful connection between the two. Looking at Joshua, the only character whose names we got from the trailer, we also get his age confirmed, the Japanese version simply saying Jusai, or 10 years old. Character profiles in Japanese often feel like dating profiles, giving you information such as age or blood type. Discussion of blood types being heavily ingrained into the Japanese dating culture. In this case, we don't get to know their blood types, but we are told that Joshua doesn't like carrots. So if you're planning on pursuing this 10-year-old boy romantically, you should keep that in mind. But also don't do that, that's illegal and immoral. And lastly, we have Jill Warwick, a girl from the northern tribes. Jill's homeland has possibly already fallen victim to the blight, seeing as the northern part of the map seems fairly dark, but thankfully she feels at home with the two brothers in Rosaria, practically acting as their sister. Or maybe she's from Sanbreku, since people have speculated that she might be Shiva's dominant. Although sending your very powerful dominant to be cared for by another country doesn't seem like a good move. Or maybe it's the best of moves. Or maybe, just maybe, I should just wait for the game to come out and stop guessing. Well, we'll see how it goes. But that just leaves the message from the developers, which is pretty much the same in both versions. Of course there are nuances, but the main points remain constant. One thing I would like to point out is this "that's right, just producer" thing squeezed in behind Naoki Yoshida's statement about being the producer of the game instead of the director. It seems to me that this is meant as a reaction to speculation in the English-speaking world about whether Yoshida would be directing Final Fantasy XVI. Maybe this means the same discussion did not take place in Japan, or that the people managing the site in Japanese didn't feel the need to address it, since Yoshida had already said he wouldn't be directing. So now we have to wait until next year to get our next big announcement for Final Fantasy XVI, but the information on the website is already a lot more than I was expecting. There is some information in the Japanese version of the site that might help us understand the world of Final Fantasy XVI better, but then again, the English version is already quite informative and often goes into more detail than the Japanese version. This suggests the localization efforts are well underway, this level of detail also suggesting that the game is well planned out, the English version not only translating the Japanese blindly, but also adding its own flair that suggests a deeper understanding of the story of the game. And now we can look forward to more information about the game next year. We finally have a reason to look forward to 2020 coming to an end. Woo! Thanks for watching what I assume will become a very long video. If you stay till the end, I want to offer you my gratitude, but also implore you to leave a comment just so I can thank you in person. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. But now that we've reached the end, it's time for the customary bird sounds.